I might want to say, just include a little personal note, which is that many years ago when I first picked up um, Spinoza's Ethics, I read this just happenstance. I just happened to open it up at Appendix of the part one and read it, and that's what really attracted me to Spinoza because it made a lot of sense. Fortunately, I opened it up in a place that wasn't the geometrical form because that would have been a little rough to get anything out of at that point. So we're going to basically cover what was in that appendix, what is in that Appendix 1, and I guess I'll begin. First of all, he's talking about God. And he's talking about, actually, the whole appendix really is talking about God. And he's talking about the nature and the properties of God. What is the nature of God and what are his properties? He knows that he necessarily exists. That's one of the proofs that he had earlier on. So he's kind of summarizing the things that he had throughout part one. So another thing is that it's unique, that God is unique. Let's see. Oops. Let me raise it. Sorry about that. Let me raise that back up real quick. Okay. Yeah, that God is unique. There's only one God, and that God operates solely through his own nature. In other words, there's nothing causing God to do what he does, as opposed to modes or people or anything else in the universe that we know. All these different things are compelled. They're compelled by the prior causes that cause them to do things, to think a certain way, to act a certain way, to behave a certain way. But God doesn't have any of that. God is totally free in that respect, free to operate without compulsion from something outside. It's just his own natural unfolding. And God is the free cause of all things. So nothing is all things that exist. All things that exist because of God. So we're all just parts of God that are unfolding and part of this expression that is God. All things are determined by God, so that even in addition to being the expression of God, all things are determined by God. So we're as this deterministic thing unfolds, all these things are just part of God. Okay. Then he talks about men's prejudice, because common perception or conception of what God is has a lot of prejudices that are not true. And so Spinoza kind of brings these out. The first one is that all things have a particular ends, because, I may have prepared this paper for the ends of presenting it at this meeting, or I may study mathematics so that I could get a better job, or I might take a shower so I, clean my body, and everything I do has a particular ends in mind. And so therefore we kind of project that into God, that God has a particular end. So God wants a certain, he wanted to create people, he wanted to create these things. And none of these are true. There's no reason to believe any of this. We're just trying to make God, in a sense, a big man, having all of man's attributes, desires, and goals. And so we're not the product of some kind of ends in mind. We're just a product of these this natural unfolding. Here, I'm letting some more people in. Okay. Also, since man has this conception of God, we think that all of the things that God creates are for the benefit of man. because we see that we have air and we have food and we have water and all these things, and that God created all these things, so it must be for man's benefit. Another thing is that God wants to be worshiped. So we think about God having done everything for us, created us to start with, and um, provided all these things that we need to survive for us. And so what can we do in return? So the only thing that could possibly be is to be worshiped, because we can't like give him a gift or can't give him money, can't do anything. So the only thing we could possibly do is worship. So he's kind of going through some of the things that the common man thinks about God, and he shows why they're just totally untrue. And he showed this throughout part one. Okay. So now he's going to explain three aspects of these ideas. The first one is why most people believe in these prejudices. The second part is the fact that these prejudices are false, and then how wrong conclusions have risen from these false prejudices, these false beliefs. So the first one is good and evil. Like we say, robbing people is bad, helping people is good, things like that. Merit and sin, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness. So we think that God has these senses that we have of good and evil, merit and sin. But what he points out to is why these prejudices exist. So first of all, we're born ignorant. So when we're born, and this is kind of an important point, when we're first born, we don't know anything about anything. We don't know anything about Christianity or Judaism or Spinoza or philosophy or Aristotle. We don't know anything. So we're born without any real knowledge. And we naturally want to seek what's to our advantage. For example, when you're first born, you notice that if you get your thumb in your mouth, it makes you feel better. So you try to do that. And you find out that if you cry, your mother will give you milk or something like that. And you try to seek everything that will help you advantage, going to school to be an educated person and getting a better job, all these things. If you're a wait person waiting on people for dinner, you got to be nice and pleasant to them if you want to get a good tip. So you try to do all these things that are to your advantage, taking maximum advantage of things so that you can get what you need. We're conscious of these appetites. So we know we want food and shelter and pleasures of all sorts. And we know that we want these things. So we're very conscious of these. Therefore, people think they're free because they're conscious of their desires, but unconscious of their causes. So we think that we're free because we think, oh, I could choose vanilla ice cream or chocolate or whatever ice cream we want, because we don't understand all the things and the causes that have brought us to that point in the world. So all of these things that brought us to the point. And so since we don't know about that, we think that we're free. Lally, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Can you hear me? I'm kind of in a loud spot.
Yes.
Okay, so when you were first talking about like God kind of just everything, he just like puts things in motion and there's a direction and he doesn't have free will. How's that different than the perspective that I've heard of this, like the clockworker or something, like setting things in motion and then like not touching it? Have you heard of that clockworker? Or has anybody?
Yeah, right. Spinoza clearly disagrees with that, because if you're going to set something in motion and walk away, you're implying that there's a separation, that there are two different things there. And God is Spinoza is very clear that there's not two separate things. There's only one substance, and we're all part of that substance. So it's not like God created everything and then left and let everything in motion, because God is still part of it. It's kind of like um, my lungs and my heart, they're all part of me. They don't do a job and then leave. They're all just continual part. Is that helpful at all? Okay, Courtney, you have a
Yes,
question?
it is. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that with Spinoza's explanation of God's, could you scroll back up in your appendix real quick so I could see um little high, all things are determined by God. So I'm assuming that Spinoza doesn't think that we have free will.
No, not at all. He's very explicit about it. All things are causally related. First of all, let me make clear that Spinoza's notion of God is not some anthropomorphic separate being that created the earth and everything. His conception of God is what you would call nature or universe or everything. So he's just using the word God, but not meaning the Judeo-Christian God.
Right. So is that to say that with Spinoza's God, even though all things are determined by that God, free will is a determined thing from that God? Are we going with that?
Well, be careful the way you use the word determinism, because it's not predeterminism. So it isn't like some ends is going to happen. No matter which path you take, you're going to end up at certain ends. That's not the way determinism works. That's the way predeterminism works, but he doesn't believe in that at all. So we're just kind of a natural unfolding. So God doesn't have any particular goals or desires or anything like that. Think about it like taking a rack of pool balls, and you put them in the triangle and you hit it, and everything kind of expresses from that initial that initial power, and it everything is just a consequence of prior things. So there's no randomness about it. So I may think that I'm making choices of having vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream, but the truth is that it's all causally related. So the little neurons in my brain that are working, none of the neurons in my brain are magic. Every single one is a bioelectrical thing that's determined by the laws of physics, laws of chemistry, things like that. It's just a very complicated thing, and we don't know what it's going to be. So it seems like there's a lot of choices and things to go on. But the truth is, in the end, it's just a causal thing. All that happened before set the universe up in a certain state, and the laws of physics are constant, and it just determines what's next. So we feel like we're free because we're conscious of wanting something, but we're not clear about why we want that. What we want is just a consequence of all the other things. It's kind of like, imagine again the pool table. You hit the balls, and one of the balls is in motion, and it thinks that it can bounce this way or turn that way. It doesn't. It's on a path, and it's going to continue through that path. Is that helpful at all?
Um, I mean it doesn't really lay to rest my concern about free will when it comes to Spinoza's God. And I shouldn't say concern because I guess that sounds like it would be more of like a worry. It's not more of a worry. I just want to understand if Spinoza thinks that people can make choices to improve themselves, or if Spinoza thinks that God has determined the extent to which we can go to be what we would consider to be good.
Okay, actually, you can make decisions all day. So you are free to make a decision of vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream. The point is, the decision that you're going to make is deterministic. So it feels to you like, oh, I'm weighing these different things and I'm going to choose vanilla ice cream. But whatever you choose, that's what you were going to choose from the start.
Okay.
So the difference for Spinoza, the difference between, and he talks about this later on in the Ethics, we have a limited form of freedom. So we don't have a freedom, regardless of what or whatever we do, is we were bound to do that. That's for sure. But what happens is some things are compelled from outside, and some things are not compelled. So if the choice came from me and not someone, holding a gun to my head or something, then I made that choice without the immediate external environment compelling me to do that. Like gravity compels me to stay on the earth, So that's the kind of freedom that he talks about later. But ultimately, there is no freedom whatsoever. Now you say, yes, but I learned this and now I took a different path. Yes, but the fact that you learned that and you took that different path was bound to happen.
So is it accurate to say something like, because I have a proposition that I give people when I discuss free will, and it's how can you have free will when the premise of your existence isn't up to you? Is this kind of along those lines? Like, yes, we do make choices and we think we do make choices, but when you ultimately think about it, you have no choice in your existence, so you don't have free will. There's no possible way you could have free will. Is this where we're at?
Right. Nothing in the universe can be any different than what it is. Right.
Right.
Imagine Columbus discovering America, right? At that exact moment, the whole universe was in a particular state. By state, what I mean is that this was located here, this had this motion, this was this heat, and all the parts in the universe were in a particular state, right? And there was the laws of nature, gravity, and all the different laws of nature, all the cause and effect. And so everything that reacts from one moment to the other is the combination of a prior state and all the cause and effects. And so therefore, the fact that you and I are having this conversation, that was bound to happen the day Columbus discovered America, because of the chain of cause and effects led up to this point. You see? So you have certain freedoms. By freedoms, what I mean is that you're the cause, as opposed to being compelled by external things. You're the sufficient cause. So, but what you're going to do, everything you are is always from prior causes. So when you were conceived, when your mother and father conceived you, you had a certain genetic code, and you also had an environment, the womb and all that. And from that point, you've evolved as the combination of those two things. So naturally, the external environment has been pretty significant over all these years because your genetics were relatively constant, right? So, but you in the end are a product of all of these causal effects that have occurred over time.
I like the idea of a sufficient cause. It adds weight to the idea of what can be determined or what will do most of the determining. It's a very interesting phrase, sufficient cause.
Yeah, because also you have to take time into account, because if you consider your whole life, then 100% of it is causal, right? But if you take a particular moment, like right now, you have a state of a bodily state with all your knowledge and all those things, which are product of all the prior causes, and then you make a decision based on that, so that you are free to the extent that you're the cause of those things. It seems free anyway. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Sure.
It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry. It doesn't make sense to me, because if things are completely determined from the moment of your conception, how can you possibly sin, and how can you possibly be punished for sin? Because in the sense, it's God's fault. God's the one who broke the pool balls, right, and set things in motion. So he set me up to be the sinner that I am. So how can I be punished?
Oh, I've got the answer for that. When your car breaks down, you need to take certain actions to fix the car, right? You're not blaming your car because, oh, I can't believe the engine won't start. No, it doesn't start. You call a repairman. He comes and takes certain actions to fix the car, right? Well, that's exactly what punishment is. So when someone's committing crimes, they're hurting society, and you made a rule that we don't like that behavior. So we're going to take certain actions in order to correct that. It may be educational, it may be punishment, it may be something like that. But you're trying to apply a force to that individual so that they don't produce those kind of actions anymore. That's what punishment is. That's what jail is. And so in a sense, it's not your fault as if you had you were a free agent. Just like if my car breaks down, it's not a free agent. It's just a fact that it broke down. So when someone commits a crime, I'm not considered, they don't have to be a free agent. I just say, look, this is a broken thing and we need to fix it. And the way we fix it is, again, through education or punishment or something like that. We can't just let this thing go awry. Does that help?
Sort of.
Pardon me?
Sort of. I guess I just don't like it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things about Spinoza is he's not trying to make you feel good, and he's not trying to make it sound convenient. He's trying to find the truth of things. So, and Spinoza, on one hand, is extremely difficult to understand. And on the other hand, it's very simple to understand. And what I mean by that is it's complicated to understand because of our own prejudices, because we think a certain way, and what he says is completely different from the way we think. Let me give you a good example of that. There's a lot of sense in society that, you know, when you're young, you decide what you want to do with your life and you go and do it. So, and then you get good at it and you take school and, you know, so in the sense, what happens is you decide what you want to do for various reasons, and then you work on it and become better. But what's really happening is the reverse. What's happening is you get exposed to a bunch of things when you're young, and you naturally find out what you're good at. And so therefore you get pleasure from those things and you say, I want to do that. And so then you follow through and fine tune that ability that you have. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of things that he discovers, it's kind of like imagine going back, you know, a few thousand years and speaking to some people about things. I mean, the number of prejudices that they have, and you would think to yourself, really, you believe that? You think that if you cut your tongue and spread your blood on the crop that they're going to grow better, you know? You know, I mean, or you sacrifice this virgin that somehow you're going to get the rains. You know, it's just phenomenal. And most of the people back then would say, yeah, of course that's true. They must agree with it, otherwise they wouldn't allow something like that. So the thing is, we've come a long way, and we think we're modern, just as they probably did 1,000 years ago, but we still have a lot of prejudices. And the nice thing about Spinoza, he was able to somehow escape a lot of that and discover what is really going on here, what's happening here, and that's what his ethics is about in part. Does that help?
You sound like you know what you're talking about. I still don't like him. Sorry, I'll listen.
Well, imagine if you were a devout some religion X, right? And then you start reading somebody where they say that's not true, and you know, it's offensive. It's not pleasant, and it's not pleasant for a couple of reasons. One reason is because, you know, you've built your whole life on these beliefs, and it's upsetting to have a disagreement about it. But it's also upsetting because it doesn't sound right. You know, it sounds wrong because it's contrary to the way you've been thinking a lot of years. So, but that's the real challenge, is to try to be able to differentiate between your preferences and your culture and stuff like that and reality, you know, what we can really see. You know, a good example, well, I gave some good examples, was like, you know, all the crazy superstitions they had thousands of years ago, or today, whatever. You know, it's really there's no connection between, you know, throwing virgins in the fire and getting good rains. You know, we know that now. You know, sometimes it happens coincidentally, but there's not a causal relationship there. And so he's trying to get away from all of these prejudices and to clarify what it is we actually know. Because if you know the truth, you can actually do a lot of things with it. If I say I'm trying to build a wheel, but I'm building it square, I can believe all I want. but I'm never going to build a good wheel, a functional wheel, if it's square. But through scientific study and thought and stuff like that, you can realize that a round wheel is much more functional. And then you would start building that. So if your society's stuck on a square wheel, on one hand, you might get along better in your society, but you're not going to be able to make a good wheel. Does that help?
So this isn't really a theology of God. This is more like the underpinnings of why science works, or how science is developed.
Right. Basically, it's a preponderance of evidence. You know, you try to find evidence of things, and you can't know for sure. There's no way you can do infinite number of tests or know absolutely anything, for sure. So what you do is you say, look, most of the time when I drop a glass, it falls and breaks. So I don't want to do that anymore. It's a scientific method. And it doesn't matter how much wishful thinking you have, it's a physical thing that happens.
If I may, Blake.
Sure.
I think that, Lally, when you say it's about science, it really is about science. And there are necessary laws prevailing through the entire world. They're laws of physics, and we are part of nature, and those same physics apply to us. And they're necessary laws. There isn't any room for contingency whatsoever. In other words, nothing happens by chance. Everything is determined. And the reason that so many of the philosophers of this period embrace this notion of absolutely necessary physical laws is because they could correlate logic with it. And they felt like they could make demonstrative proofs about the nature of the world because they could, in the case of Spinoza, virtually identify rationality with the laws of nature. So he could make arguments and say, this is necessarily the case because the laws of physics are necessary laws. Nothing happens by chance. Nothing happens by accident. There's no contingency whatsoever. Everything is predetermined. So in terms of, free will, God doesn't have free will. He is, in a sense, the laws of nature, right? So he doesn't have any choice about what he could do or would have done, or, you know what I mean? He doesn't have a consciousness or anything like that anyway. But so certainly it's about science, not religion, this book.
So I have a question about this discussion that we're having currently. To me, it doesn't seem to be related to studied philosophy, whether you like something or not. There are some philosophers that I agree and enjoy their philosophy, and some that I don't. Yet they still all do have a claimed philosophy and some kind of method for which they, espouse their argument. So I don't really know if it's worth discussing whether something is likable or not, or appeals to certain people, because it really can appeal to different people just based on their own beliefs and thought systems.
Yeah, it depends on whether you understand the work or not, or whether you're just taking it as a threat to your other beliefs. Because if you, I think if you understand it, I think that it's hard to disagree with it. I don't think it's possible to disagree with it. So, in fact, that's actually an interesting thing, because if two people are talking and they disagree with something and one person's completely right, then the other person obviously just doesn't understand it, right? Because if they understood it, they would agree. It's like 2 and 2 is 4. We can't, if one person thinks 2 and 2 is 5, and the other one thinks it's 2 and 2 is 4, and they're arguing over it. The one that thinks 2 and 2 is 5 obviously doesn't understand something, right? So it's not really a matter of opinion at all.
But are all philosophies based on logic? Because I think that they vary in the methods they use to come up with their arguments.
I don't know if that's true. A lot of them come up with ideas that are, all the philosophies don't agree. So if two philosophies have a point they disagree on, one of three things is true. Either the first guy's true, correct, and the second guy's wrong, or the second guy's wrong or correct and the first guy's wrong, or neither one is right. Those are the only three possibilities, right?
Has there been like kind of meta conclusions on, you know, how to address all the different conflicting parts of different philosophies?
I don't think so. There isn't like universal agreement about a lot of things. It turns out that think about medicine. You know how some people use medicine from their doctor and some of them use alternative methods and alternative medicines and stuff like that. I think that there's a lot that we don't know for sure, although Spinoza's very sure about what he's saying. And so people just like to use their own opinion. Think about two people that are in a different religion. I mean, logic and reason don't really play a role, right? And some religions are founded on faith, right? Which is the definition of faith is believing in something without any reason to believe in it, right?
So I guess the reason I'm coming, I know I sound like really cranky. I just got finished reading The Big Picture, and The Big Picture gives a very, very detailed sort of parallel, you know, philosophy based on scientific reason and comes to the same conclusions as Spinoza. But so if this is like a scientific theory instead of a theological theory, then it follows the science rules of what a theory is, what an ontology is. And that is that each theory, like, has a parameters within which its laws apply. So I would apply the same thing to Spinoza. I would ask what are the parameters within which his explanation applies, because there are other explanations or other theories that may have equally valid rules but have a different world frame set to apply to. And I found The Big Picture a lot easier to read because it was very explicit on where it applied and what it applied, and you could actually use its own premises that it starts with to look outside of it and to see, because to me, I can never understand anything until I can jump outside of it and see it from, you know, see its parameters, see what it's applying to, and compare it against what it's not. So I very much use like a dialectical thinking when I look at things. So anyway.
Yeah, it's my opinion and Spinoza's opinion, I believe, and that of many other people, that Spinoza was his philosophy is not another point of view. It's the truth. And for me personally, the reason I say that is because I've read a number of philosophies and religions and customs and things like that throughout my life. And every time I've read them, it's clear to me right away where they took the wrong turn, or they're basing it on just a cultural thing or something like that. It seems very clear that it's not logic and reason based. And I could go through probably a ton of examples of that. But Spinoza's different. And you say, where did he get his perspective? Well, if you read from the beginning, he starts out with some definitions, and definitions are just how he's going to use those words. And then he has axioms. Axioms are things that we'd all agree are true. They're just obviously true, right? And then he comes up with these propositions. And so based on using these definitions and assuming these axioms are true, then obviously this proposition has to be true. And then now he has some more truths. And then he goes to the next thing and says, okay, now if that's true, then these things must be true. So Spinoza, probably far better than any other philosopher I've read, you can actually see where his conclusions come from. You can actually go through each step and say, okay, this is the logical reason why, you know, X, Y, Z. So, so when you ask me the question, you know, how did he come up with these ideas? He's very explicit about that. Very explicit. His, you know, as you know, his book is written in the fashion of Euclidean geometry. So it's as logical as you can possibly get. And so other philosophers have tried this method, like Descartes, who's actually started this method with philosophy, but they failed in it because they hit points in their logic that didn't add up, and then they try to get around it but some way. But Spinoza really saw it through. Does that help?
Can I jump in for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is a good example of why it's really hard to understand Spinoza, because if you think of panentheism in terms of like a religious framework or a spirituality framework or like an explanatory framework from like those particular perspectives, you'll be upset with Spinoza for the wrong things. Spinoza was excommunicated for this particular idea about God because when it was examined, people realized that this particular God could not be used to any one particular religion's advantage. Spinoza doesn't allow people to say that God causes destruction in the world. Spinoza places the blame of destruction on people. He also places virtue on people as well. So it's not as if he takes God and says, well, God actually runs the universe. It's more like God is the universe, or everything that is the universe is in God. So it doesn't allow for an interpretation which would be like, well, God creates sin in the world. God just created the world and the rules and the laws of the world, the universe itself, all that stuff. Those laws are God. Like that's how Spinoza looks at it. So it can be adapted towards a method of understanding, you know, how to start to observe reality. I mean, I wouldn't give it the same credit as the later Enlightenment philosophers, you know, like Kant. I mean, those guys, they expanded upon some of the theories of Spinoza. So they're going to have more advanced ideas. But as far as a foundation, Spinoza is a pretty good philosophical foundation towards ethics and towards understanding nature, even though he wraps it in a God.
Yeah, there's 3 points you touched on. First of all, Judaism is not based on belief like Christianity is. Judaism is a bloodline. You know who your mother is. If your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. So they didn't expel him because of his beliefs. What happened was in Spain and where did Spinoza? So Spinoza's parents were sent away from not Spain, that other country next to it.
Portugal.
Portugal, yeah. So they were sent away because they didn't want Jews in their country, right? Portugal took the Jews. I mean, the Netherlands took the Jews not because they loved Jews. They took them because the Jews were good at shipping. The Jews were good at shipping because when you ship from one country to another, you don't trust them because you're from different lands, you speak different languages and stuff. But the Jews all spoke Hebrew. And so they were able to do shipping very well. So the Netherlands wanted the Jews to help them with the shipping, but they didn't want them messing with their religion. So the Jews were supposed to stay in this ghetto, and they had agreed to not mess with the Christians and not talk to them about religion and stuff like that, and just stay to themselves. Spinoza was espousing these radical ideas, and the Jewish community wanted to say, he's not one of us. We don't want, we don't want to be connected to him because we don't want to get punished for what he's saying. So that's why he was excommunicated. What he actually believed, they couldn't care less. It's just they didn't want the wrath of the Christian community in the Netherlands down on them. So that's why he was excommunicated. In terms
It was
of,
known as heterodox. He was a heterodox thinker. That's what I looked up, which means not orthodox against like the Christians.
yeah, which is fine. They don't care.
Right, but
Anyway,
I'm saying that's
I mean,
why
it's
he
like-
was the
His ideas are quite radical, especially like if you're thinking about I think this is the 1400s when this is
Yeah.
occurring. So
Well,
this is like the Inquisition and stuff. Like you start saying that God is in all, like you start saying that evil is not the result of sin, but evil is actually just how God created the universe. Like people, like Christians and Jews get upset.
right. Well, evil is not how God created the universe. There flat out is no such thing as evil.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that with Spinoza's belief system, you have to take into account the fact that evil is the result of God's universe. You can't just say, oh, well, it's bad. It's the result of God's plan, and it's in God. See, when you start to really think about that stuff, that jars a religious person. I thought that's what you were going for.
Well, what I'm saying is something different. What I'm saying is that evil doesn't exist at all. There's no such thing.
But that would be a contradiction.
No, there's all there are facts. There are no good.
I mean, evil does exist.
No, it doesn't.
Well, I mean, it doesn't exist in objective terms, but I mean, you'd have to say that there are things that we would consider to be bad.
Yeah, those are cultural. Let me explain. It's kind of like you and I agree on what good air is. We do because of our physical makeup. We both require similar air. So we agree this is good air and that's bad air. So they have a value, a relative value based on our bodies, right? Now, if there was a creature that had a completely different air, it would say our air is terrible and its air is good. But really, it's just a fact. It's just whatever the air is. So good and bad, good and evil are just a personal perspective. And you and I share that perspective because there's a lot of similarities between my body and your body. In other words, like
it's relative.
It's relative, yeah.
Good and evil is about.
Yeah, it's not an absolute that there's evil in the world or good or bad. There's just a bunch of facts. There's a bunch of things, but there's not a good or a bad. That's really relative. And so keep in mind that for Spinoza, again, he's just equating God with nature, and nature is just whatever the facts are. Oh, the other thing that you said was that the philosophers subsequent to Spinoza expanded on his ideas. I don't think that that's really true. I think that they took advantage of some of his ideas, but there's an interesting thing about philosophy, which is a lot of philosophers built on, Aristotle and Plato and Kant and all these philosophers, they built on and learned more. But Spinoza kind of sticks out of the side. So he created a whole system which explained everything, and it's like a complete system. So I don't know of any philosopher who is built on Spinoza. So that's one of the strange things. He doesn't.
Why do you keep saying that it's a complete system?
Well, because he goes from basic premises and finds the whole solution to the problem that he's trying to solve. So he understands it completely. It's not, there's not like holes in it and why is this, why is that? Everything's explained. It's a complete system. So he's one of the, what they call the system builders, because a lot of philosophers would study this aspect of philosophy or that aspect, and he didn't. He built an entire system which is stands on its own. So
Can I ask a quick question?
sure.
Okay, sorry. So you mentioned determinism, and I'm assuming Spinoza is deterministic, right? Okay, how is determinism different than fatalism?
Okay, very different, because fatalism says it doesn't matter what I do, I'm going to end up married to this person, or I'm going to end up, in this situation. But that's not, fatalism implies that you could take a lot of different paths and end up the same place. But determinism says your entire path and your end goal are all determined. So it's not just the end goal, it's the whole thing. So predeterminism would say, oh, something figured out the whole path and now we're just following it, which is not true either. So determinism is that everything, every step is going completely along with this prior cause and the laws of nature. And so it's a causal effect of this chain of events. Does that help?
Yeah, so would it kind of go to, what is that? I think in Shakespeare, like the moving hand doth writ, and having written, like you can't erase any of it or something?
Well, you can't erase the past, right? Whatever happened is in stone. It happened. And since the future is based on the prior events and the laws of nature, the future is just as much in stone as the past is. We just don't know what it is. So it's
But that's a deterministic, like that quote is deterministic, or okay.
yeah, that's completely
That's
determined.
what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Okay. Nick? Nick, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hi. Not a question, maybe just a comment, because I realize we get on a discussion that's interesting, but the kind of tangential to the text reading. But I think it's important, so I just want to contribute my perspective on that, because I think 2 sessions earlier there was also some debate. For me, it's not very important whether I agree or disagree with Spinoza, because I'm not sure, right? Until I finish reading his thoughts, his work till the end. But I find him interesting as a philosopher because his thought in general tells me how to view the world in a monistic way. And he's very different from the other philosophers in the sense that his monistic approach is kind of consistent with Parmenides, pre-Socratic, but very different from many others who Descartes and then and even to the modern days all have this pluralistic perspective. And somehow, obviously, it's politically correct in our daily discussion to be pluralistic, but philosophically, a monistic view of the world and why that monistic view can help us to understand better. That's very interesting to me. So I don't think I need to agree or disagree for me in order to study Spinoza. I want to understand him. I want to understand how he formulated his thoughts, the times at which he formulated his thoughts and the impact of his thoughts, etc., etc. So I just want to put that thought in our discussion. I don't think, and all those good discussions are fundamental, and I don't think we can resolve it by a very brief Q&A exchange. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
Right. So it sounds like you're interested in it from a like historic, interesting perspective. I might argue that it's not possible to understand Spinoza and disagree with Spinoza. Because if you understood it, you would see the logic and you'd say, of course, I agree with that. That's obviously true. So to the extent that you disagree, I would say you don't understand it. And that's just my personal belief. And I think it's what Spinoza said as well. James?
Yeah, I think I agree with Nick that you don't have to disagree or agree. But he is doing philosophy in a certain way, right? He's using reason to posit something that is beyond what finite reason could know, right? Because if you look at it from a Kantian point of view, he's doing transcendent metaphysics. You know, to posit that there's a God or that the ultimate substance is nature is not beyond what we can experience, you know, within our lives.
Well, Spinoza believed that there is sufficient observations that man is equipped with sufficient reasoning capabilities to understand the truth. It clearly says that. So, and also I might want to add that he's not here trying to understand the laws of physics. He's trying to understand philosophy and enough to understand to get where he's trying to go.
Yeah, but he is us. We are equating our, equating his understanding with with science and physics, right? And modern science and physics are making, if they're making postulations beyond the understanding of physics, we don't understand the ultimate laws of physics. We understand some of the laws, but we don't understand all the laws.
Actually, James, the philosophers at this time and the scientists of this time, and there wasn't a clear distinction between the two, they thought they had absolute certain knowledge of the physical world. They thought their laws were perfect and perfectly valid.
Like
In
Newtonian.
the sense that they were logical, right? And so that's really why all these philosophers, many of them, I mean, as far-fetched as, Descartes was really one of the pioneers in the application of modern physics to what we refer to now as philosophy, but Hobbes and Leibniz, I mean, they all embraced physics because they thought those laws were absolutely perfectly true. There was nothing ambiguous about it. And they could, as I said, I mean, the laws of physics, when you talk to a scientist and he's talking about physics, he's using rationality, right? He's using logic to explain. And he's saying this is a certain law of nature. And I know that because I'm using my rationality and I'm using logic to prove it. And that's why they all embraced it. So, who cares what happens in the rest of the history? The point is that these guys believe they had perfectly valid, certain, true physical laws that they could depend on, that they could map out and express in logic. And the other thing is that many people still do believe that their laws, the physics they created was true and perfectly valid. It's not like
Definitely.
It's become obsolete. None of this stuff has become really obsolete.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Up to even Einstein, agree with Spinoza that based on his understanding that somehow his understanding of physics was precise and accurate enough that he could make the assumptions or agree with Spinoza. But then we get to quantum physics, there's some uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty there about what the ultimate laws are. And there's that uncertainty is what would possibly we can lean on to question the Spinoza's assumptions or metaphysical assumptions. There's reason why Spinoza is a idealist philosopher, or he's in the category of the idealist philosophers, right? He's
He's a
think-
rationalist. He's a rationalist.
Right,
And
but he's a
the laws of
rational
physics they
yeah.
had was
Right.
rational. So that's
rational
why
idealist, yeah, right. Because he's positing something based on reason, of course, that is somehow beyond perhaps what reason can possibly know for certain.
I think we just have to just make a distinction when we are kind of like agreeing to agree on a philosophy, whether we are agreeing based on the context and the knowledge that existed then, or whether we are agreeing based on the context and knowledge that exists now. Because if we are agreeing with what they had, it does make sense. But if you think about it in terms of now, with much more, theories that have been put out there, and I was just putting the physics in the chat as an analogy. I mean, I don't know philosophy enough to know like what else is out there that is better than Spinoza, if at all. But I think we just have to make that distinction between how they fared with the knowledge that they had versus like how we would look at this argument in terms of the knowledge that we have currently.
I'd like to add this real quick about the subatomic particle idea or uncertainty principle. Is that there's nothing in the uncertainty principle that gives us free will. All it does is it adds random events to a deterministic world. So it still doesn't negate the fact that there's no free will. Lila, do you have anything else? Lally?
Oh no, I'm sorry. I need to put my hand down. I think it would be interesting though to read what Einstein thought about Spinoza for sure.
Oh, well, one of Einstein's books was he said explicitly, in fact, I have it, that he believes in the God of Spinoza. And in fact, one of the books that was published during Spinoza's lifetime, the preface is written by Einstein. So yeah, he made it very clear in several of his writings that that's what he believed in, what Spinoza said.
That would be
Yeah,
interesting because it's like a conjunction of science and religion.
Right. Now, one of the great quotes from Einstein is that where he said that God does not play dice. God does not play with dice. That means that everything that happens, you go to Las Vegas, you play dice, right? You play a crap game, and you're using dice, and hopefully, it's all based on chance, right? But Einstein said that God does not play dice when it comes to the creation of the world. That everything is deterministic, based on the laws, right? And so yeah. So there's no randomness, and there's no chance involved in the world, deterministic world. But but that assumes that we can understand, or we can somehow our minds can say that, and based on the assumption that what the ultimate laws are. And according to quantum physics, there is like the uncertainty principle. There's all kinds of things that we don't understand about the quantum world, and there's like 10 or 11 interpretations of what the quantum event is, and so we're not able to make those assumptions about the ultimate laws of nature.
Well,
So
I would
to say like to take like a materialist view primarily, and not account for anything like supernatural, let's say, would you say that Kant would rule that out?
Well, I can't speak for Kant. I don't know Kant well.
Would his system rule it out?
Yeah, Kant is definitely arguing against the that kind of speculation, right? He says that there's two kinds of reason. One is what, practical reason, and the other one is speculative reason. So, so he would say that Spinoza is relying on speculative reason. It's going beyond what the human experience is.
Well, that's not really true, because if you look at the axioms that Spinoza's philosophy is built on, these are obviously things that you can demonstrate in reality. So it's built on a solid foundation. It's not just an imagination, kind of like Whitehead, who imagines a whole bunch of things, but it's not really grounded.
Right. That's assumed that we understand the minutia of reality. That would include quantum physics, right?
Yes.
Which we don't understand completely.
Right. So it's hard to actually argue about it. I know I read A Brief History of Time by Hawkins, and he has one or two sentences in there where he says the universe might be 100% deterministic, even at the subatomic level. It's just that we don't understand the laws yet.
Could I just intervene to say that there is an interpretation of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation, which dovetails beautifully with Spinoza's metaphysics. There is no contradiction, and it's the point is that quantum mechanics does not have philosophical implications except through the medium of an interpretation. And we really are at liberty in this stage of our knowledge to choose whatever interpretation suits us best. So if you want to put this whole line of worrying to bed, just go for the many worlds interpretation. You'll see that there is no tension between that and Spinoza's metaphysics.
Right. So it's still an interpretation, right?
Sorry?
It's still an interpretation.
That's all anyone can offer.
Sure.
Quantum mechanics is just a bunch of mathematical recipes.
Right.
As far as physicists are concerned, as far as philosophers are concerned, it doesn't mean anything except through the lens of an interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the interpretations are physically equivalent. They make exactly the same predictions as regards the physics. But there are questions that physicists don't agree on, whether, for instance, the wave function in quantum mechanics is actually an element of physical reality. Those are the ontic interpretations, or whether it's just a calculating device, and those are known as the epistemic interpretations. And there's nothing in the physics that enables you to choose between the two. But whichever side you come down on has philosophical implications. But it's the philosophy that's on shaky ground, not the physics.
Well, I just want to say I love this conversation, because I think when you get down to it, philosophy, science, and religion all merge somehow in a way that we don't know. And I think this is just so fun.
Well, Spinoza, as far as he's concerned, there is not and there cannot be any contradiction between the two. As far as Spinoza is concerned, it's his worldview.
Well, wasn't Stephen Hawking trying to come up with a theory of everything, right? Everything would be an understanding of all the laws of nature, right? And operating in harmonious fashion. But we haven't arrived at that there yet. And
I'm trying to do that too.
yeah, and so Spinoza is he's on track to do that. And if you agree with him, then then there's an assumption that we can we know the ultimate laws of nature, and that the theory of everything.
He doesn't actually commit himself to any particular, except in, well, a bit in book 2, but he's not locked into any particular physical theory. He does have commitments, like a commitment to causal determinism or to the principle of sufficient reason, which are very general philosophical commitments. But his conclusions are not, they don't stand to be refuted by physical theories as we know them in the 21st century. Blake, I suggest you continue, or yeah.
So now we're on part. We're in his first part of it, because he has 3 parts of this, and this is part 1, which is why most people believe in the prejudices they believe. So he's enumerating several of the reasons. So here, people think they're free because they are conscious of their desires, but unconscious of the causes, which is something I spoke about earlier. I know I want chocolate ice cream, but I don't know all the causes that cause me that, so it seems like a free choice. So, and that's just as short-sighted. Men seek an ends and believe all things seek ends. So we seek ends like, going to the grocery store, getting some sleep, taking a shower, whatever, going to college. And so we think all things must seek, we're like projecting our own personal goals onto all of nature, and that's not true. Okay, so next one is they see the things they have that can help them and believe that they are there for that purpose. So they would believe that like we needed the rains in there, and we thought that God provided the rains. If we behaved in a certain manner, then God would give us these certain the rains. But the truth is, these events are just independent of our desires. They're just events that happen, and sometimes they coincide with our desires, and sometimes they do not. So he's really showing you the causes of all these errors. Since many of these things were found instead of made, they must have been made for man's benefit. So, yeah. So we don't know what made trees and what made air and all these things, but since they're good for us, they must have been made specifically for us, as opposed to the reverse, which is that we evolved out of these kind of things. Since they don't know anything about whatever is made from these things, they impute it was made for their sake and benefit. And these gods made these things so man could worship them. For what else would we get in return? So when we're trying to seek our advantage, we see that when we try to seek our advantage, we see what's good for us, and we try to think, what could they possibly want? So we think the only thing we could possibly give them is worship. So that's what we do. Man strove to understand the gods so that they could gain the most benefit. So the more we understand about how to please the gods, the more benefit we can get. The rains we want, things like that. So these are just man's best stab at trying to figure out their world and try to get the most out of it that they can. So these are primitive ideas before science, these ideas of sufficient reason and all these other ideas had evolved. So Lally, do you have something?
Yes, sorry. So you mentioned that most things are or all things are coincidental. Is that right?
All things are coincidental? No. I mean, it's just some things are not a coincidence. It's just
no, but I mean, did Spinoza believe in most things being coincidental? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Oh, no. I mean, that's something that you judge, because a lot of things are happening simultaneously, right? And so anything happen, you're just saying, oh, this is a coincidence, these two things arose. It's just
okay. Because I know there's an well, I don't know if it's a Jung aspect, but a concept, but it's like synchronicity, and I don't know if Spinoza would believe in that. No? Okay. Just curious.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to E here. In the end, being no connection between worship and gain, they really only show the logic of their own belief, the illogic of their own belief. So basically, they go around all these plans and they have all these beliefs about how to worship God in ways to get what they want, but it doesn't help at all. So if you're looking at it from a logical perspective, you would realize that that's not the connection. Also, a way that a lot of religions get around that difficulty is they say God must have a bigger plan. So they'll say, I did X, Y, and Z according to my religion, but I still didn't get what I wanted, so God must have a bigger plan. Of course, the problem with that argument is that anything could happen at all, and you could say, well, there must be a bigger plan. So it may make you feel better, but it's not very helpful. Okay, so now in the part 2 of his answer is he wants to show that these prejudices are false. So the first one is God has no ends or goal. So there's nothing in nature where we can see it's purposely looking for some kind of ends. It's just kind of unfolding and evolving naturally, right? So that's here, it unfolds. If there is an end in mind, then the effect would precede the cause. So yeah, that's an interesting contradiction, because if I said, I want to graduate college, so therefore I'm going to take all the steps to go to college, sign up and get transportation there and whatnot. But in that case, the ends preceded the cause. The end was I wanted to graduate college. That's my goal. And it came before me going to college. So it doesn't make sense. It's a complete contradiction. Okay.
But wait a minute. Isn't that what happens with determinism?
No, it works the other way around. There's a cause and there's effect. There's a cause and effect, cause and effect. It isn't an effect and then a cause.
So you're saying that determinism, you're saying that we don't know what the effect is, right?
No. It may, in our mind, we may say, something has caused me to want to go to college. And then in response to that effect of wanting to go to college, that effect will become a cause that'll cause me to go out and sign up for college. See,
but I didn't think this was about our minds. I thought this is God's mind. So the universe is deterministic, which means it already, right from the beginning, it already knows where it's going to end up. So the goal is there.
No, God doesn't know where he's going to end up. It's unfolding naturally. There's no representation in God of the end of a result 100 years from now. All they have is the seeds of it now.
So I think, actually, Blake, I think that there is. It's a question, but God is in eternity, and he understands and recognizes the consequences, the chain of causes and effects, and he's in eternity. I mean, this is a very superficial view I'm taking, but in a sense, God does know everything that's ever going to transpire in the world, because he's already there, so to speak.
From the perspective of nature and naturans, yes.
Yeah,
exactly. There's no cause and effect. There's just a whole that he can see, right?
Right. Yeah. So even based on that kind of God's eye view of knowledge, there is no free choice, right?
Right, because this one, I mean, it's like the sample I gave before about the loaf of bread on the table. The whole thing is there. It's done, and you can look at it.
Okay.
That's God's eye view.
Okay. So because God has already predetermined everything.
No, nothing's predetermined.
Okay. So
that's kind of a bad word.
Yeah.
Yeah, Blake, I wonder if you might need to make a distinction between fatalism and predeterminism, because determinism in physics does include the idea that the future is fixed, okay, which is not the same as fatalism. So what you're excluding is fatalism, but perhaps it's causing confusion the way you're using the word predeterminism.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And that, again, that has to do with natura naturans versus natura naturata. Are you looking at it as a sequence of events, or you're looking at the whole thing?
Yeah. It sounds like the difference between bad infinity and good infinity.
Don't know what that is.
I guess, you know, for Hegel, bad infinity is when you only look at it, look at the steps in terms of the steps leading to, leading up to that. But where good infinity is you're taking the whole thing at once.
Right. Hey, Ali.
Yeah, so I sorry, I just joined and I'm just jumping into the text. I haven't read it before, but isn't this actually in some ways actually also in some ways analogous to the Aristotle's final cause, where it says basically the purpose of you do it, it's for that sake for which a thing is done. Does that correspond with if there's an end in mind that fact would precede the cause? That actually is final cause for Aristotle?
Well, the point is with the part that he's talking about over here in the appendix, he's talking about natura naturata, which means a sequence of cause and effect. And so that's what he's talking about, is this perspective. So when there's a series of causes, you don't get till the end until you go through all the sequence. So they're there in a sense because the state's already there and all the consequences are going to be there. It's kind of like hitting the balls in a billiard table, right? You know, in the end, they're going to end up in certain positions, but as they're going through it, it's just where they are at that point. So it isn't like they're all trying to get to the end. They're just following at the cause, and that's where they happen to end up.
Yeah, there's virtually no final ends in Spinoza.
Right.
I mean, he argues against that notion at great length. He denies final ends altogether. Ali.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So I think in a way, what I'm understanding is it's like at this point in time, this particular clause is stating it's almost deconstructing the idea of cause and effect.
Could I try to answer Ali's question? He is explicitly refuting Aristotle's teleology, okay, the idea of a final cause. And the motivation for that is just the success of 17th century science in explaining everything in terms of efficient causes. And that really is the only type of causality that Spinoza recognizes. And in fact, it's the only type of causality that we recognize as a result, in fact, of the success of the 17th century scientific revolution.
Right. Well, there's no end because there's no final cause because God is the beginning and the end, right? I mean, there is no end, but the God.
No,
is
but just final simply in the sense of acting with an objective
right
in view, an objective to be attained sometime in the future.
Sure, right.
He simply refutes that completely as far as God is concerned.
Right.
Clearly, we finite beings do have aims. Okay, we aim to stay alive.
Sure.
So we do have objectives, but Spinoza's view is that everything can actually be explained in terms of efficient causation. So the traditional view of man is that, in Christian theology is that we act for reasons which we choose freely. But Spinoza says, no, that's not the right way to look at things. We act because of antecedent causes, which we are generally ignorant of. It's really quite a different picture, but he's taken fully on board the success of 17th century science and saying that philosophy has to be consistent with that.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah.
Okay, so the next thing where he shows these prejudices is that we're taking things that Spinoza would consider perfect, which is everything, and calling them imperfect. They're only imperfect from a personal perspective. For example, like the example earlier, like air that's not good for you. You say, well, this is imperfect air. But the truth is that it's just the air that it is. It's perfect for it's the 100% response to the prior causes. It's perfect as it is. And if you say that there are certain imperfections in the world, and if God created everything, then God is creating things imperfect, which is a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. And when they say, like some theological treatise will say that God wanted, God was lonely and wanted to create other beings that could worship him and things like that. So you're kind of implying that God lacked something and wanted to go out of his way and create these things, which doesn't make any sense. They explain things by virtue of ignorance. We do not know why. In other words, that's the same example I gave earlier, which says God has a bigger plan. We don't know what that plan is. So therefore, you can explain anything. You can, you do X, Y, Z and say, well, I couldn't help it because, God had a bigger plan for me, and it's just the way it went. So there's no more like responsibility. To use their logic and effect to show that the stone falls from a building in order to kill a man. So things happen just as they happen. They're the natural unfolding of God. They're the reaction of cause and effect of nature. And we try to say, I mean, it's ridiculous to think that a rock went out of its way to hit us in the head, right? But yet we think people do, really only because they're more complex. So, but when we realize that people are just as causally determined as the rock, then we realize there's just the same effect there.
Now, when you say when we realize that people are just as causally determined as a rock, that gives me pause.
Okay, that's a good question, because this is actually very key to Spinoza's philosophy. The idea is this: if I'm walking down the street and a pebble falls from a building and hits me in the head, I'm going to rub my head and say, wow, that's smart. And I'm going to walk the other way so that I don't get hit by any other potential. But I'm not going to get mad at the pebble. I don't get mad at the pebble because I don't think there was any intent there. It was just cause and effect, right? However, if someone walks over and slaps you in the face, you get upset because you say, how dare they slap me in the face? They had free choice and they could have not done that, but they decided to do that. So now I'm upset with them. So the difference between the guy slapping you and the rock is that you think one is free and the other one's not. But when you realize with Spinoza that neither one was free at all, so that the day you were born, this guy was bound to slap you. There was no changing that. So it doesn't mean you have to sit and take it, because when the rock hits you in the head, you didn't just sit there and say, oh, that's okay, it didn't mean to. You get out of the way. You move out of the way so that no other rocks hit you. Likewise, if someone slaps you in the face, you can defend yourself. You could slap them back. You can do whatever you want. So you can still take action. But the difference is you wouldn't get upset because you wouldn't think, oh, he shouldn't have done that. Why'd he do that? You would realize that it was bound to happen that he was going to do that. And I'm going to take whatever actions I'm going to take. We're going to take anyway. But that's the difference. And that's very key. And that's underscored in part 5 of the Ethics. Does that help?
It helps, like, so yeah, I definitely don't know a lot about Spinoza, but it's just some of the things like that you've said, like the causal thing. I just find it so contradictory. On the one hand, you say that Spinoza wouldn't really say our lives are predetermined or our existence is predetermined, but then we don't have like causal we don't have causal determination abilities from
Well,
what you.
Yeah, at any given moment, your actions are made up from two things. The external environment forcing you to do something, like if someone held a gun to your head or gravity or something like that, those are things that you're compelled to do. And then there are things that you're not compelled to do at that moment, which is like choose vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream. That's an internal state. Now, of course, when you take time into consideration, a larger span of time, you realize that those are just as causal. So the difference is between one is just looking at your state currently and saying, okay, currently, there's part of the decisions I make are from me, and part of the decisions are being compelled from externally. So the ones that are determined by me, I call those free. They're not actually free because when you look at my entire lifespan and all the causal relationships, that caused all my internal state. But when you look at a fine sliver of time, then it looks like, oh, part of this decision was me. And that's what I feel like was a free action. But it's not, it's an illusion. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I was thinking to myself, free will sounds like an illusion. That's the last word you said.
Yeah. So, Ollie?
Yeah. Okay. So just to be clear, we have two aspects. One is basically we're saying there is from a teleological perspective, there is no cause and effect. Like we are not actually going for the telos of this is this effect basically. But we do what Spinoza is saying is he's saying that things are also causally determined. So there's a separation. Like I'm just trying to clear the confusion between the two concepts for myself. That on one side, he's saying that from a teleological perspective, there is no effect, but at the same time, he also is saying that there is actually causal determination. Is that correct?
Well, there's two perspectives. One's called natura naturans, and the other one's called natura naturata. Natura naturata means the sequence of events from causal effect, and it entirely explains everything, right? But since now, when you look at the past, it's a solid thing. In other words, it doesn't change or vary. The past is the past, right? So even though you may not know all of the past, it is a solid thing. So since the solid thing and all the laws of nature are solid, then all the consequences from there are solid too. So that the future is just as much in stone as the past. We just don't know what it is, right? So if the past is solid and the future is solid, then you're looking at one solid thing. If you took into account all of time, eternity, all at once, then you would realize that it's just one solid thing. So the answer is it's the same thing looked at in two different perspectives. And Spinoza calls them natura naturans and natura naturata, right? And that's in part two, which we'll get more into. James?
Yeah, this idea of social responsibility. I mean, we revise laws to grant rights to people in order for them to exercise more freedom. And with that freedom is also involves, must be people must be held responsible for what they do, right? And so in that sense, you have to assume that there is at least an illusion of freedom in order to live in society, because we're constantly being
James,
yeah.
we understand your point. How can you have moral responsibility if everything that unfolds in the world unfolds of necessity, right?
Yeah.
And this is what's fascinating about Spinoza. He's writing an ethics where nobody has any choice about anything whatsoever. Okay,
Yeah.
everything that will ever happen in your life doesn't involve, like, how shall I put this? Necessity prevails in every moment of the world, right? And yet you are morally responsible for yourself. That's what makes Spinoza a good read.
Yeah. But if that's the case, if you say that you have no responsibility for anything, then you can't assume, you can't understand why we have laws, and we revise the laws in order to make sure that people have the rights that they do, and laws that restrict people from doing certain things that they are held responsible for if they cross the line, to break the law. So
Could I
that's
just
why,
say, James, that
that's
Spinoza
why,
is well aware of these issues
Uh-huh.
and will deal with all of them at length, in book 4 and later on in his political treatise. He's not naive about the questions that you're raising. He's very well aware of them and does propose to answer them.
Okay.
Right. And the example I gave earlier also about punishment, deterministic world, about the car. The car breaks, you don't blame it for breaking, but you still have to take action to fix it. And so punishment is kind of that fix. Okay, so the next thing here on the list here, I, is that we don't know how these things came about, the human body and all that, because we can see a lot of things that make sense, but something as complex as a human body or an animals and stuff, we don't know, we don't understand, especially back then, how that could evolve, how that could happen. And so we just kind of say, well, something must have created it then. So these are just kind of fallbacks of logic where you just don't know, and you say, well, it must have been, this or that, because everything that I know that was complex was built by man. So it must be something man-like that built something so complicated. Okay, so part 3, he shows how these wrong conclusions that I just went over have arisen, these false prejudices. So why we have these false prejudices from these false conclusions we have. So as I said earlier, man, we judge everything from our own perspective. So you look at good and evil and warm and cold and beauty and ugliness, and you look at all these things, but they're not truths in themselves. In other words, warm and cold is a great example. What I consider warm and cold may be different from a penguin, because he has a different physical structure. So all we're really defining is what's relative to your body. It's not what is anything in and of itself good or bad, right? And then if you judge things as good and evil, beauty and ugliness and all that, because then you would have ways of measuring praise and blame, sin and merit. Because if somebody does something that's good, then it's praiseworthy. If someone does something bad, then it's blameworthy. But if you don't have a good and bad, there's not really a good or a bad about it. It's just a fact of what happened. So again, none of these things are good or are true at all, except insofar as they relate to man. And man believes that all things are created for his own sake, which is something I talked about before. And here's another thing I talked about before. So you and I agree what a good temperature is. We may both agree that 70 is a great temperature. We do, because that's the temperature that our bodies work well at. That's the temperature where we feel most comfortable. So you're not really saying that 70 degrees is a good temperature. What you're really saying is that our bodies are similar and operate best at that temperature. You see? And so all of these notions are modes of imagination. So imagination are things that you just kind of make up in your mind. So you're looking at everything from your own perspective. It's things made up in your mind as opposed to being truths outside in the real world. And so these are men of imagination, because you'd all agree that 1,000 years ago, people were more driven by imagination than reason, certainly before the age of reason. They didn't understand that things were mathematically explainable or describable, and how you could use this information to predict the future. I predict that if I put this water under the fire, that the water's going to get warmer, as a simple example. But of course, this is what's allowed us to go to the moon and create X-rays and all those kind of things by learning the truth of nature. So by learning what their truth is, for example, these new supercomputers they're developing, they operate at close to absolute zero. So if you were looking at good and bad, if you were judging things by just good and bad, well, that's a tremendously bad thing for people to live in that temperature. So, but when you look at it as just a fact, it's just this temperature or that temperature, then you're much able to operate. Another argument that people will use, or another argument that you can use, is that why didn't God make us more perfect? So why am I so weak and subject to my emotions, and why do I keep gambling and drinking and all those kind of things? So it's a contradiction about the perfection of God. And so the answer is, the truth is that we're a product of the natural unfolding of God and not a particular goal of God's. So God didn't set out to create something what we would call perfect or imperfect. He just...
And
Go ahead.
I was sorry, I would also add, just using your argument from earlier about evil. I mean, weakness is relative. Having too much emotion is relative. Maybe it benefits some other purpose that you haven't seen yet. So, because you were talking about how evil and good were relative, so I think it's, I think that, yeah, it just makes sense, and that idea of the concept.
Right. Spinoza is going to argue that we're emotionally driven. So we view ourselves as logical beings, reasonable beings, which are annoyed by our emotions. But Spinoza is going to show the reverse is true, that we are driven by emotions. So, and that's...
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, Ali?
Yeah, so I think another question here is like, when you're talking about natural unfolding of God, is it in some ways, like, I'm just jumping ahead. So Hegel's notion of science of logic, basically, when he's talking about being and nothingness and the becoming part, essentially, and becoming is essentially linked with the idea of like unfolding in some ways. So and again, I think Hegel builds on that, or like takes a position against that. But I think what I'm interested in, like, essentially there is no goal to be somewhere, but essentially the natural unfolding is essentially part and parcel of the immanent God that he's conceiving.
Yes. Well said. Yeah, I agree.
So that unfolding could end up in disaster, and God would have created a world that would end up in disaster.
Well, there's no such thing as disaster. A disaster is just a human perspective. They're just things that happen. I mean, it's disaster to us if a volcano goes off and kills a bunch of people. Yes, we call that a disaster. But from God's perspective, that's just an event that happened. It's just a natural unfolding.
Well, it's easy to forget that Spinoza is extremely radical about this. He says that God creates everything that it is within his power to create. This is his inexhaustible fecundity or creativity. There's nothing left uncreated by God.
Right.
And he's clearly not acting with our interests in view.
So is what Spinoza is saying really this unfolding is very similar to what Hegel was explicating about the history of
Well, for Hegel, as I understand him, history is going somewhere, and that's not Spinoza's view.
right. Yeah, the absolute, but it sounds like it's very similar, except that it's a dialectic, whereas Spinoza there's no dialectic that's described in more detail, right?
Well, there is this principle of plenitude that's first enunciated in Proposition 16, and that God creates everything that falls under the conception of an infinite intellect, and he reiterates that later. And what Blake has there on the bottom of the page is another affirmation of that in the appendix. He says something. I just remember the Alwa's translation that in response to the question, why does God not create all men so that they are governed by reason? The textual answer in the Elwes translation is that nothing, how is it? The laws of his nature, the laws of God's nature are so vast as to suffice for the production of everything conceivable to an infinite intelligence. That's Spinoza's God. We talked about this last day, how this plenitude and necessitarianism, the idea that nothing could be different from what it is, these are actually two sides of the same coin. Spinoza's God is radical. It's really quite different from the God of the traditional religions.
Yep. Lally, you had something?
Yes, I do. So I was just I'm always trying to think of exceptions to the rule. Just it helps me to kind of engage with the philosophy more. So when you were mentioning like disasters, like I can see how like, when Mount Vesuvius exploded, that was like a something that God did. But I was thinking of like man-made disasters, like maybe like the bombing of Hiroshima. And would that be considered like a force of God? I don't know. It just seems to me kind of contradictory or hypocritical. I don't know.
It would be so considered, and of course it takes a good deal of effort to digest that way of thinking. Spinoza is, I mean, if you engage with him, he's really going to create quite a lot of opposition. And many people don't engage with him; they just dismiss it out of hand.
Don't you think? For all of us who are relatively familiar with the ethics, that if you use the word nature, you don't miss anything in terms of the argument that Spinoza is making. You use the word nature, and then out the window goes things like an ultimate end, some sort of divine objective, morality, all that stuff. A scientist, when he looks at nature and he sees, let's speak about a social scientist. If he's a proper social scientist and he sees violence breaking out on the street and people being killed, innocent people being killed, or political scientists looking at wars and things like that, they don't evaluate in terms of like, well, this was evil, that was evil. They look for causes, explanations. How did it happen? Why does it continue to happen, right? So really, that's really the best way to think of, don't think of God, think of nature. And nature, of course, includes the whole world, all of the world, right? So
yeah, actually, that's interesting because I see where you're coming with that. I also was thinking, well, man is kind of made of nature or whatever. Like you're thinking from an evolutionary standpoint. So anything man does, honestly, like immediately qualifies under the divine rule. If God is nature and man is nature, anything man does is going to be nature. I mean, that's how I thought of it, but I see what you're saying too.
Man
yeah,
is
but it's still,
man is completely subject to all the laws of nature, just the same way that any given animal or a plant or even a rock, they're all the same laws apply, right?
is there any part in
The only
Spinoza where he
difference is
talks
the only
about,
difference is that we have a mind, and our mind has certain properties that allow us to mistake reality for our fantasies. We think that our imagination is an actuality, when in reality there is no world of imagination. There is no fantasy world. You know, that's I'm making it sound much more austere than it actually is, because despite the fact that Spinoza says that man is subject to all the laws of physics just in the same way every other thing in the world is, he still is writing moral philosophy. And this is what's really fascinating about it. But you got to work your way through the necessitarianism first before you get to the point where you realize there's only one way to live well. And then that you'll discover in part 5.
oh, that's really interesting. So I know that one of the parts deals with the human mind as a concept, and I can't wait to look at it. But I think there's another thing. Does he mention about like what man, like the man's nature is? Does he ever define that in this book?
Part 3.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the biggest part, I believe.
Yeah, no, I am really getting, but you know what? I just have a question. You guys seem to be very pro Spinoza, and I'm not saying that's bad. I just don't know him very well. Did you guys choose to present this because you like his philosophy, or I don't know?
Yeah,
I
you
just
hit the nail on the head. Yes.
okay, because it seems that
It's not a
there's a
question.
little bit of a
I'm sorry, I don't think it's a question of whether you like a philosopher or not. It's like the question
yeah,
is whether or not he makes a good argument, whether it's a
yeah.
is Spinoza's argument ultimately valid? That's because he's a rationalist, right? It's that everything stands or falls on whether or not he can demonstrate what he's saying is true.
Yeah.
And if he does
Right.
that,
Robert, you're not actually speaking for me in the sense that I like Spinoza and his arguments are secondary to that. In
okay.
fact, many of his arguments I'm not persuaded by, but his worldview is dead on, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks. Well, it's great to learn from the people most enthusiastic.
Yeah, and for me, I had studied a bunch of different religions and philosophies when I was young, and the only one that made sense to me was Spinoza, because I never found anything in Spinoza that I disagreed with. And after I learned some stuff about Spinoza, when I read other philosophers or religions or anything like that, their errors are clear to me. It's clear to me why. Well, that's obviously wrong, So I can't say that about Spinoza. I've never found anything I disagree with.
That's great. Thanks for letting me know.
Nick?
Yeah, thanks. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to comment on earlier. Ali raised the question about the teleology, but I didn't have a chance to get in. So I want to ask a question. How to view this whole appendix. One school of thought represented by Wolfson is that this whole appendix actually is in reality a scholium to the last proposition. And the last proposition 36 is about final cause. And the whole appendix is actually an effort to demonstrate why, to explicate, why there is no final cause. And I think Patrick cited the relation to scientific progress. And there is an interesting point for me, because roughly at the same time, Francis Bacon, who also rejected
final cause for the sake of scientific exploration, which obviously had a tremendous success, as we have seen since then. But Francis Bacon made the allowance that it is possible to talk about the final cause metaphysically, even though final cause physically makes no sense. It's inhibiting scientific progress. So, let's focus on the efficient cause. But here, Spinoza collapsed the final cause to efficient cause for both physical and the metaphysical sense.
That's right. And also
so that's very interesting for me. If any of you could talk a little bit, the subtlety of his thinking when taking that path of reducing the final cost to efficient costs.
Yeah, let me try then. This is one of the respects in which I think Spinoza is a thinker of his time. He I think got sort of carried away by the success of efficient causation as an explanation of the physical world, and carried it sort of lock, stock, and barrel into the psychological world as well. And this was, I think, an almost universal movement in the 17th century against Aristotelian physics. Remember, Aristotle was a biologist, not a physicist. The types of causation that he talked about really make sense in biological terms. It's extremely difficult to avoid talking about teleology if you're looking at living systems. In fact, biologists, even today, they have to invent a word, teleonomy, because they're forbidden to talk about teleology by the conventions of science since the 17th century. They use the word teleonomy to convey the impression of teleology in the living world. So I think what's going on here is that it is possible to describe all physical systems in terms solely of efficient causation, but it's not the best way of describing things like, say, human brains or human psychology. I mean, it's certainly the case that electrons in a human brain behave exactly the same way, are subject to exactly the same laws as electrons anywhere else in nature. But we can't describe human behavior in terms of elementary physics or, efficient causation. So, I mean, that's something, it's only now in the 21st century that we're even beginning to get a handle on biological information processing as a physical process. And we're still only at the sort of very early stages of that. So
we can't forget about the fact that thought is an essential attribute too, and it is something of a radically different nature, but it's also subject to necessity. Everything unfolds in your mind of necessity, but nevertheless, thought is something that has
absolutely. It's just that the language of description, okay, in terms of efficient causation, just can't cut it. I mean, we can't actually describe adequately human behavior in terms of elementary physics. We can describe the operations of extremely small or extremely simple physical systems that way. So Spinoza was a thinker of his time. Okay, he is caught up in the enthusiasm for the mechanistic explanations of 17th century physics, which have taken hundreds of years to explore the full implications of. But it's not the sort of last word on science.
Okay, I just have to make one quick qualification, okay? We don't want to reduce absolutely everything to efficient causation.
Well, Spinoza does.
Just wait. Let me finish. Mechanical, causation prevails certainly throughout a lot of his thought, but at the same time, this is something that we contend on this point, but nevertheless, formal causation does play a part in my view without any question. I mean, God, the existence of God himself, he has existence is part of his essential nature, and that's why he exists. And when you talk about an essence, you're talking about a form. So if God exists, he is the effect of a formal cause. So I think that you have to take that into consideration too. Limited things, limited beings have essences in Spinoza, right?
Yeah, but I think we're maybe sort of getting off track here. There's another question about whether the Aristotelian notion of formal causation plays a role in Spinoza. We can take that up some other time. But the only point I wanted to make in response to Nick is that Spinoza, as far as I can see, he was fully under the sway of the success of 17th century mechanistic scientific explanation. But that's not sort of the full story of where science is going to end up in the long run. So Spinoza's view, to my mind, it's complete, but in some respects simplistic. That doesn't sort of prevent me from embracing his general worldview, but it does need to be nuanced, I think, in the long run. That's.
I just don't want everybody to think that Spinoza's vision can be reduced to efficient causation in the realm of physics. There is things like conatos, for example, can be understood to be the essence of any living being, right? The limited living being, conatos, could be understood to be part of the essence of that. So already you're talking about, like, every animal and plant as well, I should say, they want to persist in their being, and the question is, how does that fit with efficient causation?
Well, clearly it doesn't. I mean, because as soon as you start talking about biological systems, you can't really avoid teleology, and even in Spinoza. Although in what we've seen so far, he's saying that everything is explicable in terms of efficient causation. Once you talk about the conatus, you're talking about the endeavor to persist in being. That's certainly a teleological phenomenon. Certainly.
I wouldn't say that it was teleological.
Certainly it is. I mean, the effort to preserve one's being. Surely
No.
is.
I would understand teleology to be the endeavor to accomplish an ultimate end. But to persist in your being is not perfectly the same as.
Yeah, but I mean, it's driven by future goals. That's the elementary understanding of the word teleology.
And the conatus is not limited to living beings. A table tries to stay together, and when the forces are too great, it doesn't stay together anymore. But its structure determines.
Yeah. But this is actually a good example of so Spinoza actually bases his formulation of the conatus on what is now known as the law of inertia in physics, or the Newton's first law of motion. But if he had been living in the late 19th or 20th century, he would undoubtedly have taken the principle of homeostasis as the template for the conatus, which is the endeavor of a biological organism to stay within homeostatic limits, you know, with regard to temperature, blood pressure, and all the rest of it. And all of that is really only describable in terms of teleology.
Right, but it's not
But,
living things.
I'm sorry?
It's not limited to living things.
Oh, indeed. But I mean, he wants to use it to describe living things, human beings in particular.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So thanks. Could I just summarize for myself this interesting discussion? So let's say Robert made the point, maybe, you know, Spinoza is not fully reductionist, but however, if we were to take one interpretation of Spinoza by way of Wolfensohn, that he did collapse the final cause to efficient cause, just take that as one interpretation and try to explore the implication of that, then that view opened up the door to the reductionist approach, which the modern science frown upon, because that doesn't seem to explain everything, given what we know, you know, in the modern scientific way. And then if I were to pretend to be Spinoza living today, I might push back by saying, well, you just don't fully understand it, right? Just like, you know, his theory about the determinism, that the only way, the appearance of our lack of understanding, or the appearance of the lack of free will, is because we don't fully understand. We don't fully understand the mechanism that is there. And then if we turn that perspective onto this debate on the reductionism, he might say, well, it will be reduced to mechanistic causal relationship, except we just haven't got there yet.
Well, I'm not sure. I see in the chat, I think it was Anne who mentioned Sapolsky's book, which I think probably a few of us have read, his Refutation of Free Will. This is efficient causation all the way. And what's wrong with that book, to my mind, is that it's not possible to explain human behavior entirely in terms of efficient causation. It's certainly the case that everything that goes on at a microscopic level in the human brain is describable by efficient causation, but it's not possible to describe human behavior in terms of elementary physics. Okay, it's just too complex. You just need other levels of description. That's so. I think Spinoza would. Well, he's just too good a psychologist to sort of buy the line of argument that Sapolsky is presenting. I mean, he eventually, you see, what's going to happen is that in book 2, he's going to pretend that everything can be explained in terms of the elementary physics of bodies. Okay, and we're actually going to have to contend with a rather arid stretch of you know, physical theory coming up in book 2. And this is just going to present a mechanistic view of nature But then what he's going to do is it's a sort of bait and switch, because in book 3, where he talks about the emotions, you realize how psychologically sophisticated he is, and he can't describe the emotions in terms of efficient causation in the same way as he describes the physics of bodies in book 2. But what he's going to do essentially is to say that the same type of dynamics is going to be operative in our psychology as is operative in our physical bodies. He gives a theory, a very rudimentary theory, about the physics of bodies in book 2, and then he sort of does a switch in book 3, where he talks about our psychology in similar mechanistic and dynamic terms, even though he knows perfectly well that he doesn't have a complete mechanistic theory of our psychology. It's still very plausible, but it's not, to my mind, describable, our psychology, or Spinoza's account of our psychology, in terms of efficient causation. It's too complex. I mean, we're human. We just cannot be described by elementary physics.
Right. So could I let me just spend 1 minute to free this puzzle without getting into the subtleties of psychological background. Why is it, Patrick, that you seem to project a hesitancy in accepting his view on efficient causality, without reference to the, with the total elimination of final cause? There you seem to feel hesitant. However, you seem to be perfectly willing to accept in another context that the total deterministic way of presenting the world, right? And so my part of this inconsistent attitude is that psychology, we know it's complicated, but in Spinoza's framework, there's only one substance, right? So that one substance ought to apply to God as whoever defined it to nature, whoever defined it to physical body, to psychology, to whatever. All these are just in various terms, different modes, whatever. So why would we want to privilege psychology with some complexity that we claim we're not able to grasp, while we claim boldly that we fully understand what's going on in the natural world, that everything is deterministic?
Well, everything is deterministic. All of our physics, all of the fundamental laws of physics are deterministic, and those fundamental laws are operative inside human brains just as much as they are inside stars or anywhere else in the natural world. It's just that the phenomena that need to be described in psychology are too complex, to admit of adequate descriptions in terms of physics. That's all.
But we don't have any ideas in our head that are not transpiring in the physical realm, right? So
True.
The complexity, there's a perfect correlation in terms of the complexity between.
That's right. It's just that we can't describe something as complex as human behavior with simple deterministic physics. That's all. That's the only point I'm making. And the other thing that you mentioned, like, it's very clear, and I think uncontroversial for, at least for students of Spinoza, that God does not act with an end in view, that nature is too fecund to be limited by teleology. manifests itself in every possible way, but at the level of individual biological systems, it's to my mind, it's basically impossible to say what's going on without a higher level of description, which naturally involves teleology. And Spinoza, he just sort of glosses over it by saying that implicitly that the mechanistic description of bodies that we're going to encounter in Book 2 carries over under the parallelism of the attribute to an equally mechanistic description of our emotions. But he knows that there is no science available. I mean, there's still not a science available of psychology with this, anything like the same degree of exactitude of physics, okay, operating in the attribute of extension. It's just the limitations of our science, that's all. But so all I'm saying is that Spinoza's system, in some respects, is just too simple to be credible, but it has the great merit of cohering in a non-contradictory way. Almost all of the statements that he does make are true, but they don't actually, to my mind, quite add up to a complete description of the world. How could they? It's as if he had exhausted all possibilities. That doesn't make any sense.
Patrick, he doesn't really try to describe everything. He just, according to the principle of sufficient reason, he's basically just makes the claim that there's, we know there has to be a complete, comprehensive explanation for every moment, whether it's under the extension of, under the attribute of extension or thought. There has to be a complete explanation. Therefore, nothing happens by accident.
But we'll see how he needs a mechanistic account of the emotions in order to ground his ethical theory. Okay, a mechanistic account which is analogous to the mechanistic accounts of the natural world provided by 17th century physics, but didn't actually exist in his time and still doesn't exist in our time. I mean, human psychology is just too complicated to admit that type
But I mean, I think that he can
simple reductive explanation.
I think he can offer a perfectly adequate explanation of pleasure as opposed to pain, and so that there's, I mean, in general terms, I mean, I think he really does do
It's certainly a fascinating exercise that he sort of, we'll see how he decomposes the emotions into three elementary particles, elementary forces. I don't quite buy it myself, but it still doesn't affect, for me, the limitations of Spinoza's philosophy don't prevent the whole system from having the effect that he wants to achieve. He's presenting an ethical system. He's presenting it, in fact, as a path to what he calls, what was the phrase, Blake? Continual, supreme, and unending happiness. It's clear that he achieved it. It's clear to me that he achieved it. Okay, so despite, I have lots of difficulties with the details of Spinoza's system, but that's not really germane to the question of how successful his project
I think that's what,
is achieved.
I think that's what makes Spinoza really fascinating, is that he has to somehow find an ethical stance in a world of absolute necessitarianism. He has to establish an ethical principle.
Well, he's not merely proposing a code of behavior or a moral system. He's after the big fish. When he talks about ethics, he means ethics in the same sense as Aristotle or the Stoics. He's concerned with human flourishing. Okay, and his question is how, given an accurate, realistic, comprehensive understanding of our situation, how can we flourish maximally? That's what he means by ethics. So there are many respects in which it's possible, I think, to poke holes in his system, but that doesn't detract or take away from the success of his overall project. That's what I mean, Robert, when it seems to be a recurring friction between us. When I say I'm not all that convinced by many of his arguments, and it doesn't really matter to me.
Oh, well, I'm saying quite on the contrary, that it does matter to me that he can propose something like, how can we best live in a world of necessitarianism? That I think is what that tension, I think, is where what makes Spinoza really fascinating. I mean, I think that's what's
yeah, absolutely. I'm just talking about his proofs. Many of them, many of them are not, to me, convincing. Okay, but in fact, in my understanding, an appreciation of his views on necessitarianism and plenitude is critical to seeing how his overall system succeeds in achieving the goals that he has set for himself, which he calls salvation or blessedness.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be pretty important for Spinoza to persuade everyone that not only has he this general vision, but that he's demonstrated that it was true.
Well, he's also quite well aware of the limitations of the system that he presented and the limitations of rationality. When we'll see this in book 2, that what he calls knowledge of the second kind is really extremely limited in scope. It's whatever can be
limited in scope, yeah.
Limited in scope. It's whatever can be deduced by his style of argumentation from the metaphysics in book 1 and the physical postulates that he's going to give us in book 2. And he's really quite clear that this cannot actually get at what he calls the essence of particular things. There's a proposition towards the end of book 2 where he's quite explicit about this.
But that's only in the
excuse me, Robert. The point I want to make here is that he is well aware of the limitations of what he calls knowledge of the second kind, what can be achieved through reason. Okay, and he elevates what he calls intuitive knowledge or knowledge of the third kind into a sort of pride of place. And that's something that can only be learned through practice, essentially a spiritual practice, which he calls the intellectual love of God, which essentially imbues the mind with the idea that everything is in God and follows from the necessity of the divine nature. But that's through practice. That's learning a way of seeing, seeing all of the circumstances in one's life by referring it to his metaphysics so that it becomes a sort of second nature. And it's not really...
We're going to have an opportunity to talk about intuitive knowledge when we arrive there. But nevertheless, I do want to say this: intuitive knowledge is true. You know, it's not something like just created or something. It's true.
Well,
intuitive knowledge is true.
Unfortunately, philosophers tend to abuse this word rather badly, I think, in that the conventions of contemporary analytic philosophy or ordinary language philosophy. It says we take what we see to be intuitively true as the starting point, and then we try and build some sort of coherent system out of it.
Well,
and it just means unexamined premises. So you have to be very careful.
let me give you an example of what I understand. Let me give you an example of what I understand to be intuitive knowledge. The principle of sufficient reason, that's intuitive knowledge. That's intuitive knowledge. We know that the principle of sufficient reason applies everywhere in the world, and we know that through intuition because we don't have access to the.
My own view is different. It seems to me that the principle of sufficient reason is a pragmatic issue. Like the say the principle of the uniformity of nature. It's something that
the principle of sufficient reason is something that we can only understand intuitively, and we also recognize that it is of necessity true. But let's deal with it.
Yeah, well, I think perhaps we better let some other people jump in because we've gone a bit off topic. I'm sure Nick is wanting to sort of pursue the line of investigation he was asking about earlier.
Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, I think as much as I think, Patrick, I think I agree with you to that extent that it's in some ways this text is very historical, because I think we should remember that he's writing in Latin. And for example, when Aristotle and Plato they're using nous for a reason, and it's a very polysemic word, and it has a particular connotation in the Greek culture. And when we move all the way to Latin texts, essentially, it's translated as ratio, ratio. And it's very reductive compared to, for example, what nous was. And of course, and as you're saying, like it's going back to the mechanistic worldview that they are actually responding to. But what is interesting for me is that there are two parts. One is that he is presenting his arguments in the same way Euclid would present his basically treatise. So it's very geometric, like all the way ethics. That gives you a hint on what kind of like framework he has in mind. But what is interesting for me is the whole notion of the amor de intellectualis, which is the love that he brings into that picture as well. So Spinoza then becomes as a very complex kind of thinker as well. He's against a Jewish background as well, because in Judaism that the concept of transcendence is extremely emphasized, and he's actually emphasizing something like immanence, which is a hallmark of features like, for example, Hinduism as an example, or at least Vedantic philosophy, Advaita Vedanta. So he's moving to immanence, basically. He's basically taking a very radical position against his Judaic genealogy. And he is going, so I think that all these things make him a very complex kind of thinker as well. And it's not easy to kind of like put him or pigeonhole him in one or the other. Like, for example, just the notion of the love changes our perspective of what does he have in mind. Of course, I want to explore, as you're saying, books 3, 4, 5, where is this going to, these radical positions are going to take us. I think it's probably it's just a method that he's using to take us to that particular aha moment where you can experience what it is like. So for me, I think this whole exercise is more like a method. Sorry about the long point.
No, I think you're perfectly right. There is an awful lot of depth that we have to go into in order to get a real feel for Spinoza's thought, and we probably will have sort of major disagreements about his because he's that unusual a thinker. As Blake said, there is nobody building on Spinoza in the subsequent development of Western philosophy. He's sort of at right angles or orthogonal to the entire tradition. And like Blake, I sort of encountered Spinoza relatively early and really never, well, at least for philosophy, never felt the need afterwards to look anywhere else, at least not in the Western tradition. Probably, Mahayana Buddhism is a sort of better introduction to Spinoza than most of the Western philosophical tradition. He's that singular of a figure. Nick, did you want to?
Yeah, thanks. I realize that we're over the time. So, but quickly for me to put a full stop to the discussion on teleology. So now I understand you, Patrick, what you were saying. So we cannot reduce everything to elementary physics. That's what your point.
Yeah.
So the point is more is needed, right, in order to
Sure,
explain.
yeah.
Then let me make one last push back. So what is that more that is needed in order for us to explain? It seems to me there is no necessity to resort to teleology right away, right? We need more to explain what we have in elementary physics is not sufficient. However, what more we need, maybe just more science, right? Why do we need to jump to the conclusion that we have to resort to teleology? So that was the point made by the Spinoza.
What my own view is that teleology or teleonomy, the appearance of teleology, is necessary in order to describe the functioning of biological systems. And biologists like Michael Levin, who publishes a lot on YouTube, are beginning, I think, to understand how the information processing in biological systems, that's basically what teleology is eventually going to be grounded in physics. Specifically, well, I don't want to go sort of way off on a tangent. I see how it's going to unfold, I believe, in physics with people like, or biology and physics with people like Michael Levin, or the neuroscientist, what's his name? Carl Freston. Both of those guys have published lots on YouTube. And there is a sort of revolution underway, but it's not going to come to fruition in our lifetimes. So I think all that's missing from Spinoza is 23rd century science. It's sort of in the pipeline, but it's not here now, and it certainly wasn't there in the 17th century.
We started
sorry?
sudo/etc/init.d/nfs user server space restart, and that'll restart the NFS server. Then we need to do
NFS server. Who's running an NFS server?
init utils-initd.
Blake, I don't think you're speaking, Blake. Who's speaking?
I think that Blake was just broadcast. No, that wasn't you, Blake? Wonder where that was coming from.
Being a software guy, I actually understand him though.
Yeah.
It was AE interfering or interrupting our conversation. Or I mean AI.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so Nick, that would be my answer. It's Spinoza is on the right track, but he couldn't supply complete answers in the 17th. So Nick, just to sort of wrap up the discussion we were having, I think that's all that's missing from Spinoza is 23rd or 24th century science. You know, I think science is going to be able to fill in the gaps in his system, at least the gaps that I see. But we're not there yet by any means.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. Actually, my personal view is against the Spinoza on this point, but nevertheless, I want to push to the extreme his
Yeah,
reasoning.
actually, Nick, I would like to hear an extended exposition of your view on Spinoza at some point. I would be interested to, because it would actually make for a more fruitful exchange between us.
Yeah, happy to do that. So just assign me a passage or whatever. Yeah.
Well, why don't you? Well, just I mean, when the time comes, just look ahead a bit and see what interests you, and we'll slot that for you.
Everything we've been reading, yeah, everything.
Okay, well, we're coming up now to book 2, which is really the I think the most difficult part of the ethics to read, particularly the physics. But then there is his theory of knowledge coming up. I think, well, it's very specific to him. I'm not sure that it would be of any broader interest. I understand, Nick, that you're sort of interested in comparative or historical philosophy. And this particular part of Spinoza probably is of less interest to you than books 3 and 4. Just my guess. But by all means, just let us know when you would like to jump in.
You mean the book 2 we're going to read, right?
Yeah.
No, that's interest. That's of interest to me. Yeah, that's of interest.
Well, we're just beginning to plan how to work through book 2. This week, I actually have to post a meetup event page for for book 2, and if all goes well, we'll